September 17, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. 1300 hours. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, 3. Jagdgeschwader 26, watched through binoculars as 291 B-17 bombers approached in tight formations. The Luftwaffe had studied these American bomber groups for 14 months. Every intercept, every gun camera film, every pilot report analyzed in Berlin. Weber's orders were clear. Attack head-on, break their formation, drive them from German skies. But what German intelligence didn't understand was that American fighter tactics had evolved beyond what their reports described. The escort fighters weren't flying the defensive patterns anymore. They weren't circling bombers like shepherds watching sheep. What happened over Germany that autumn would force the Luftwaffe to rewrite every tactical manual they possessed. Not because of better aircraft, because of better thinking. By September 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a crossroads. The 8th Air Force remained committed to daylight precision bombing, despite devastating losses. August 17th alone saw 60 bombers lost over Schweinfurt and Regensburg in what crews called Black Thursday. Each bomber carried 10 men. That was 600 aviators lost or captured in a single day. German fighter doctrine remained essentially unchanged since the Battle of Britain 3 years earlier. The Rota system, 2 aircraft working as leader and wingman, had served well since Spain in 1937. 4 Rota formed a Schwarm in the Finger 4 formation pioneered by Werner Mulders. Against Allied bombers, Luftwaffe fighters approached head-on at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, targeting cockpits and engines in the 5-second firing window before breaking away. This doctrine assumed enemy fighters would remain tied to bomber formations. It assumed German pilots could choose when and where to engage. It assumed the Luftwaffe controlled timing and position. For 2 years, these assumptions held true. American fighter doctrine in early 1943 reinforced German assumptions. P-47. Thunderbolts flew close escort, forbidden from pursuing enemy fighters more than 5 miles from their charges. Luftwaffe pilots learned to wait beyond that invisible fence, assemble formations at leisure, then attack when American fighters couldn't pursue. The February 1944 shift began quietly. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, newly appointed commander of the 8th Air Force, issued new fighter orders, simple words that changed the air war. Fighters would sweep ahead of bomber streams, seek out enemy aircraft, destroy them wherever found. The invisible fence disappeared. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, received the new orders on February 11, 1944. His response, recorded in unit records, was immediate. Finally, let us hunt. The next mission demonstrated the transformation. March 3, 1944. Berlin. Zemke led his P-47s ahead of the bomber stream by 30 miles. When German fighters assembled near Brandenburg expecting bombers, they found American fighters instead. The ensuing battle cost the Luftwaffe 23 fighters. Zemke lost 2. But this wasn't individual initiative. This was systematic doctrine change, implemented across the entire 8th Air Force within weeks. Every fighter group received the same orders. Every group implemented the same tactics. When one group discovered effective methods, intelligence officers documented them, distributed reports to all units within days. The Americans had adopted the Finger 4 formation the Germans invented, but they added something the Luftwaffe couldn't match: systematic organizational learning. When a tactic worked, it spread through the force like water finding cracks. When something failed, the entire force stopped doing it within a week. Luftwaffe tactical reports from March 1944, recovered from German archives after the war, noted increasing aggressiveness from American fighters. But the reports missed the fundamental nature of the change. Individual German commanders saw the shift, but information moved slowly up the chain of command, even slower back down. By the time Berlin understood the transformation, 3 months had passed. In those 3 months, the air war's outcome was decided. Oberleutnant Klaus Schröder, 27, flew with Jagdgeschwader 3. He was shot down May 27, 1944, bailed out over Allied lines, was captured. During interrogation, he provided testimony preserved in Allied intelligence files. In 1943, we owned the sky beyond escort range. We assembled formations at our convenience, attacked at advantage, broke away when we chose. By March 1944, everything changed. American fighters appeared overhead before we left the ground. They knew our assembly points, our approach vectors. They didn't wait for us to come to them. They came hunting. Schroeder described watching American fighters patrol in relays. When one flight ran low on fuel, another arrived to replace them. Continuous coverage. German fighters, operating from bases with shrinking fuel stocks, couldn't match this persistence. The numbers revealed what words couldn't hide. January 1944, Luftwaffe fighters achieved a 4-to-1 kill ratio against Allied aircraft over Germany. Fighter Command reported this to Berlin as proof of German tactical superiority. By July 1944, 6 months later, that ratio reversed. 4 German aircraft lost for every Allied plane destroyed. Training time explained part of the collapse. 1942 Luftwaffe pilots received 240 hours flight training before combat assignment. These pilots arrived at frontline units with solid flying skills, adequate gunnery training, some tactical understanding. By mid-1944, training time had dropped to 110 hours. Fuel shortages, instructor losses, and desperate need for pilots at the front compressed training to bare minimums. American pilots arrived over Europe with 400 hours flight time, including 30 hours dedicated gunnery practice. They'd fired their guns hundreds of times before seeing combat. Many German pilots in late 1944 fired their guns for the first time when enemy fighters appeared in their sights. But training alone didn't explain the Luftwaffe's collapse. Deeper problems existed in the system itself. German fighter doctrine assumed numerical parity or advantage at the point of contact. It assumed friendly airfields were safe zones for formation assembly and damage recovery. It assumed enemy fighters would remain tied to bombers, allowing German fighters to choose engagement timing. Every assumption proved false by summer 1944. American fighters outnumbered German fighters over Germany by March 1944. German airfields, once sanctuaries, became hunting grounds. American fighters strafed parked aircraft, attacked formations during assembly, pursued damaged German fighters to their landing fields. The systematic nature of these operations revealed coordination the Luftwaffe couldn't match. A Luftwaffe historical section study, dated August 1944, provided brutal assessment. The document was 3 pages long, classified für den Dienstgebrauch, for official use only. It was signed by Major Hans Trautloft, a respected ace and tactical theorist. Allied forces recovered it from abandoned Luftwaffe headquarters in 1945. The report's key paragraph read, "Our pilots must attempt to counterbalance obvious disadvantages through greater combat effectiveness. However, effectiveness requires experience. Experience requires survival. Current loss rates prevent accumulation of experience among newer pilots. Experienced pilots compensate through skill, but grow exhausted flying multiple missions daily without adequate rest. This creates a cycle from which we see no exit given current resource constraints." The report recommended immediate adoption of American-style fighter sweeps, aggressive engagement of enemy fighters before they reached German airspace, and concentration of remaining veteran pilots into elite units, while newer pilots gained experience in less critical sectors. None of the recommendations were implemented. The resources, time, and fuel needed to execute such changes no longer existed. By September 1944, 1 year after the Schweinfurt raid that prompted this analysis, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Germany, not from lack of aircraft production, which actually increased through late 1944, not from lack of brave pilots, though experienced pilots grew increasingly scarce. The loss came from fighting an enemy who learned faster, adapted quicker, and possessed both resources and organizational structure to implement lessons across entire air forces, rather than individual units. The recognition of American tactical superiority appears in captured documents with remarkable clarity. An October 1944 fighter school training manual, recovered from Luftwaffe flight training archives, devoted 3 pages to American fighter tactics observed over Germany. The manual instructed new pilots to avoid extended combat with American fighters if at all possible, to attack only when numerical advantage was overwhelming, to break contact immediately if additional enemy fighters appeared. This represented complete reversal from 1943 doctrine that emphasized aggressive engagement and combat persistence. The manual essentially told German pilots, "Avoid fighting unless you have no choice." The human cost appeared in individual stories that statistics couldn't capture. Unteroffizier Hermann Müller, 19, was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 11 in July 1944 with 112 hours total flight time. His personnel file, preserved in German military archives, shows he'd volunteered for fighter service, scored high in aptitude tests, and impressed instructors with his flying ability. His first combat mission occurred July 18, 1944. American P-51 Mustangs from the 307th Fighter Group intercepted his formation during assembly near Magdeburg. Muller's aircraft was damaged by gunfire, but he managed an emergency landing. His flight report noted he'd never seen enemy fighters move so fast, never expected them to be overhead before German fighters formed up. His second mission came the next day. Same result: damaged aircraft, emergency landing, more experienced pilots saved him. Third mission, July 21st. Muller didn't return. His wingman reported Muller attempted to break away from attacking Mustangs, but misjudged his dive angle, entered an uncontrolled spin he lacked experience to recover from. No enemy bullets struck his aircraft according to the wingman's account. Insufficient training and exhaustion were listed as contributing factors in the incident report. Muller's story repeated across hundreds of young German pilots in 1944. Brave, determined, willing to fight. But facing opponents with better training, better tactics, better equipment, and crucially, better systematic application of lessons learned from every mission flown. The American approach to tactical evolution became a case study in organizational learning. After each mission, intelligence officers debriefed every pilot who returned. What worked? What didn't? What did enemy pilots do? These reports went to group headquarters. Groups compiled lessons learned, distributed them to all units through formal channels. Successful tactics employed by one squadron spread through the entire 8th Air Force within 2 weeks. Gun camera film provided objective evidence of what worked and what didn't. Evidence-based doctrine rather than theory or tradition. The Luftwaffe lacked this systematic feedback system by late war. Communication between units degraded as phone lines were bombed, radio frequencies were jammed, and headquarters relocated constantly. Fuel shortages prevented the formation training needed to implement new tactics. Pilot rotation from frontline units to training commands, which had shared combat experience with new pilots, ceased as every available pilot was needed at the front immediately. One final document captured the transformation with devastating clarity. An April 1945 Luftwaffe situation report, dated April 3rd, 1 month before German surrender, noted that fighter operations over Germany had become nearly impossible due to overwhelming enemy fighter presence and superior enemy tactics. The report was 1 page long. It noted that experienced pilots were exhausted, new pilots were inadequately trained, and American tactical coordination exceeded German capabilities to counter with available resources. The report arrived at a headquarters that barely functioned. It received no response. It was filed, forgotten, and recovered by American forces 6 weeks later. The transformation from Luftwaffe tactical superiority in 1943 to complete American air dominance by 1945 took less than 18 months. But that transformation didn't begin with better aircraft or more pilots. It began with better organizational learning. The Americans built a system that captured lessons, distributed them, and implemented changes across thousands of pilots simultaneously. The Germans relied on individual excellence without systematic spread of that excellence. Today, air warfare doctrine taught at every military academy worldwide includes the 1944 transformation of American fighter tactics as required study, not as history, but as current operational principle. The lesson is fundamental. Tactical superiority comes not from individual brilliance alone, but from systematic learning applied across entire forces. The United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs requires all cadets to study the 8th Air Force evolution in their tactical doctrine courses. Cadets analyze the shift from defensive escort to offensive fighter sweeps, learning how organizational structure enables or prevents tactical adaptation. The course includes actual mission reports from 1943 and 1944, showing the evolution in real time. There's a principle taught in every military staff college called organizational learning velocity. How fast does your force learn from experience and implement changes across the entire organization? In 1944, the 8th Air Force learning velocity measured in weeks. The Luftwaffe's measured in months, if changes happened at all. That velocity difference decided air superiority over Europe more than any single piece of technology. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-51 Mustang hangs suspended above a German Bf-109G. Both aircraft are marked with their wartime unit insignia. The placard between them reads simply, Air Superiority, 1944. Not won by technology alone. Tour guides, many of them Air Force veterans, explain to school groups and tourists that these two aircraft were roughly equivalent in performance. The Mustang had longer range. The Bf-109 could climb faster. In a dogfight between equally skilled pilots, either could win. But the war wasn't decided by individual dogfights between equal pilots. It was decided by systems, by organization, by who learned faster and applied those lessons more broadly. One visitor comment in the museum guest book, written in June 2018, came from a retired Luftwaffe officer visiting from Germany. My grandfather, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, flew Bf-109s over Germany from 1943 until he was severely wounded in January 1945. He survived the war, rarely spoke about combat, but late in life he studied what had happened. His conclusion stayed with me my entire career. He said Germans fought individually with great skill. Americans fought systematically with organizational learning. System beat skill when resources were anywhere near equal. The lesson applied to more than aerial combat. It applied to how organizations succeed or fail at any endeavor. That lesson extends far beyond military aviation. It applies to any organization facing adaptive challenges in competitive environments. Do you learn from experience systematically, or do you rely on individual excellence without spreading that excellence across your entire organization? Do you have mechanisms to capture what works, distribute that knowledge, and implement changes quickly? Or do good ideas stay local, trapped in individual units or teams? In 1944, the Luftwaffe had excellent pilots, capable aircraft, determined leadership, and a proud tradition of tactical innovation stretching back to World War I. They lost air superiority because excellence lived in individuals rather than systems. Outstanding pilots compensated for inadequate organization until they were killed or exhausted. New pilots arrived without the benefit of lessons learned by those who came before them. The Americans built something different, a system that turned average into good and good into excellent across thousands of pilots simultaneously. Individual American pilots weren't necessarily better than individual German pilots in 1944, but the American system was dramatically better than the German system. In sustained competition, system beats individual almost every time. Werner Mölders, the German ace who pioneered the Finger Four formation and revolutionized fighter tactics, in the late 1930s, was asked in a 1941 interview what would determine the war's outcome in the air. His answer, preserved in his personal papers archived in Germany, was remarkably prophetic. Superior tactics will defeat superior numbers if the numerical advantage isn't overwhelming. Individual pilot skill matters greatly in the short term, but superior systematic application of tactics, spread rapidly across an entire air force, will eventually defeat both individual excellence and local tactical superiority. In a long war, whoever learns faster and applies that learning more broadly across their entire force will dominate the skies. The side that can turn lessons from one combat into doctrine for 1,000 pilots within weeks will win, regardless of how many aces the other side produces. Mulders died in a flying accident in November 1941, before American fighters arrived over Europe in significant numbers. He never witnessed how accurately he'd predicted the outcome. But his words described exactly what happened from 1943 to 1945. The Luftwaffe studied American fighter formations carefully. German intelligence officers wrote detailed reports. Senior commanders read those reports. Some understood the implications. But understanding isn't the same as implementing. Knowledge isn't the same as systematic organizational change. By the time German commanders fully recognized American tacticals, superiority and systematic learning advantages, the resources, time, and breathing space needed to match that evolution no longer existed. In war, as in many competitive endeavors, learning faster than your opponent isn't just an advantage. Sometimes it's everything. The ability to fail, learn, adjust, and try again repeatedly and rapidly beats the ability to do things right the first time, but slowly. When the Luftwaffe did something well, that success stayed local. When the 8th Air Force did something well, that success spread across the entire force within days. That was the difference. Not courage, not technology, not even individual skill. It was organizational learning velocity. And in that measure, the Americans were simply faster.